You think silence means they've forgotten you. It doesn't. Not always. Sometimes the quiet they created ends up becoming the loudest thing they've ever had to sit with. At first, they call it peace, they call it space, they call it freedom. But eventually, that same silence starts to echo back at them, and suddenly it stops feeling calm. It starts feeling like loss, like memory, like the sound of a heart they once held carelessly and never learned how to hold right. That's where everything shifts, because the real turning point doesn't happen when you're crying in front of them, or begging, or explaining yourself, or asking for another chance. It happens later. It happens when your warmth disappears, when your energy stops reaching toward them, when the person who once tried so hard to understand them finally just stops. Stay with me here, because this is the part nobody really talks about. The moment they actually feel your absence, that's when the mask starts to crack. The control they thought they had starts slipping through their fingers. The distance they used like armor turns into a cage, and for the first time, they're not running from you anymore. They're running from the truth. They didn't just lose your attention. They lost the one person who loved them patiently, gently, without any hidden agenda. And when that realization hits, it hits hard. People like this often live wrapped in the illusion that distance equals safety. They believe that staying detached means nothing can really touch them. To them, love feels risky, closeness feels dangerous. Being emotionally open feels like handing over power. So when someone shows up offering real, steady, honest care, it presses directly on the spot they've spent years trying to protect. Instead of leaning into that love, they stiffen up. Instead of accepting it, they interrogate it. Instead of trusting it, they test it, pulling away, going cold, becoming impossible to read. And every time you stayed anyway, every time you made excuses for their behavior, every time you forgave things that really needed to be addressed, they took that as confirmation that nothing needed to change. They assumed you would always be there, not because you explicitly promised it, but because your consistency slowly built that expectation in silence. You were the one who responded, the one who explained, the one who softened misunderstandings, the one who stayed steady when things became uncertain. Over time, that steadiness stopped being noticed as something valuable and started being treated as something automatic. Always understanding, always available, always waiting just a little longer than you should have. And that is how comfort zones are quietly formed in relationships, not through one big moment, but through repetition, through your patience becoming predictable, through your emotional effort becoming a background structure that no one consciously acknowledges anymore, but everyone unconsciously relies on. Like a foundation under a building, it is only noticed in its absence, never in its presence. Your effort at some point stops feeling like effort to them. It stops registering as something that requires care or reciprocation. Instead, it becomes part of the environment, like air in a room, necessary but invisible, present but not appreciated in proportion to its importance. And once something becomes invisible, it also becomes undervalued. That is the quiet shift most people never recognize while it is happening. Not a sudden loss of respect, not a dramatic change in feeling, but a slow reclassification of your presence in their mind. From active emotional participant to passive emotional constant. From someone they engage with to someone they assume. Your patience becomes the framework that holds everything together, but frameworks are rarely thanked for holding weight. They are only noticed when they start to bend. And because you kept showing up, even in moments where clarity would have required stepping back, the dynamic began to reorganize itself around your availability. They learned, often without realizing it, that they do not need to meet you halfway with the same urgency you bring. There is always more time. There is always another chance. There is always your understanding waiting at the end of distance or inconsistency, so the emotional pressure that should have been shared becomes quietly one-sided. Not because they are intentionally taking advantage, but because the system has taught them that your presence is stable enough to absorb imbalance. And when someone's nervous system senses stability that never breaks, it stops preparing for consequence. It stops anticipating loss. It stops adjusting behavior with care. That is when effort becomes invisible, not because it has no value, but because it is no longer perceived as something that could ever disappear. And this is where emotional dynamics subtly shift without either person fully noticing. You are still giving, still showing up, still maintaining connection through understanding and patience. But internally, something begins to change. The emotional return no longer matches the emotional output. The reciprocity becomes unclear. The recognition becomes inconsistent. Yet because you have already established a pattern of endurance, the system around you expects continuation rather than correction. So your patience, which may have originally come from care, slowly turns into expectation management. You start carrying the emotional weight not just of your own feelings, but of keeping the connection stable enough that it does not collapse under its own imbalance. And that is an invisible labor most people never see. Because holding something together quietly does not look dramatic from the outside. It does not demand attention. It does not announce itself. It simply maintains continuity. But internally, it requires constant emotional regulation, constant restraint, constant adjustment to prevent disruption. Meanwhile, from the other side, that stability can begin to feel like permanence. And permanence, once assumed, is no longer actively valued. It is simply expected to continue, until one day, when that stability shifts even slightly, everything suddenly feels uncertain, because what was never consciously appreciated was never consciously understood to be finite. This is the paradox of emotional reliability without boundaries. The more consistent you are in holding things together, the more invisible that effort becomes. And the more invisible it becomes, the less it is emotionally protected or reciprocated. Not because you are unimportant, but because you were never experienced as something that could be lost. And it is only when presence begins to change, when availability becomes less automatic, when patience is no longer infinite, that people begin to realize the weight it was carrying all along. But by then, the dynamic has already revealed its truth, that what felt like stability was actually your sustained effort, and what felt like permanence was actually your quiet endurance holding everything in place. But here's what they never fully grasped. Their sense of control was never actually strength. It was borrowed from your presence. It depended entirely on you reaching out, on your softness, on the emotional labor you kept putting in, on your refusal to quit. So when that finally stops, when you quit calling, checking in, carrying the relationship by yourself, the entire structure starts to wobble. Pay close attention here, because this is where their calm turns into consequence. When you first walk away, they usually don't feel what you're feeling. You feel it instantly. The grief, the confusion, the disbelief. They don't, not right away. At first, all they feel is relief, like they can finally exhale. The pressure lifts, the emotional weight lifts, the mirror you held up to them disappears. They tell themselves it was for the best, that the connection had gotten too intense, too heavy, too complicated. They convince themselves the distance was the mature, healthy move, that things will settle down now, and deep down, they still expect you to come back. That expectation matters more than people realize because it's what keeps them relaxed. It lets them stay emotionally untouched. They figure this is just another cycle. You pull back, hurt for a bit, then return with the same love, same hope, same open arms as always. But then something they didn't plan for happens. You actually stay gone. You stop performing loyalty for someone who never bothered to protect it. You stop translating their silence into excuses on their behalf. You stop treating their fear like it's your job to manage. And slowly, the atmosphere shifts. The same silence that used to feel effortless starts to feel strange, then heavier, then personal, then unbearable. They start checking for signs, a text, a like, some familiar signal, and there's nothing. That's when things start moving in a direction they never braced for. Not because they lost some game, but because they're starting to realize there was never a game to begin with. Their breaking point almost never arrives in one big dramatic moment. It builds quietly, in layers. First comes memory, small things, your laugh, your timing, the way your voice would soften when they were tense. Messages they used to barely glance at now hit differently in their mind. Moments they once brushed off start glowing with new meaning. What felt mundane before now feels precious. What felt irritating before now feels tender. They start replaying scenes they never fully appreciated while they were actually living them. The patience you showed during hard conversations, the way you kept showing up even after being let down, the way you gave them breathing room without ever fully letting go. At first they call it nostalgia. then it sharpens into something closer to regret, because memory has a cruel way of doing this. It doesn't hand things back the way they actually happened. It hands them back with clarity. Suddenly, they can see exactly the kind of care you gave them, the steadiness, the emotional safety, that rare kind of love that wasn't trying to trap them, just trying to meet them where they were. And now, from a distance, they finally start to understand what they were standing inside of the whole time. Keep listening, because this is where their denial starts to crumble. They come to realize your love was never pressure. It was peace. It wasn't control. It was connection. It was never too much. It only felt like too much because they'd never learned how to hold something real without instinctively treating it like a threat. That's the cruel irony in all of this. They're not heartless. They're scared. But fear, when it's worn long enough, starts to disguise itself as pride. It starts sounding like logic. It dresses itself up as independence, high standards, self-protection, emotional discipline. But underneath all that language is the exact same old instinct. Don't need too much. Don't feel too much. Don't let anyone get close enough to actually matter. The problem is, real connection does matter, and it leaves marks. They might shut down in the moment. They might go numb right when love is standing in front of them. They might look completely unbothered when the relationship breaks apart. But numbness doesn't erase attachment. It only delays the pain. And delayed pain can be brutal because by the time it shows up, there's nothing left to do with it. No easy fix, no soft landing, no devoted person waiting on the other side of their confusion anymore. Once the numbness wears off, reality floods in all at once. That's when they feel the full weight of everything they refused to feel earlier, the warmth they pushed away, the care they dismissed as too intense, the person who kept trying while they kept retreating. And underneath all of that is something even harder to swallow. They weren't actually protecting themselves from pain. They were slowly manufacturing an even deeper kind of pain. One built out of missed chances, buried truth, effort that went unanswered, and love that eventually ran dry, not because it was weak, but because it was left alone for too long. Once they realize you're not coming back the way you used to, panic starts creeping in, even if they never show it outright. Maybe a small message, a casual check-in, a memory casually dropped into conversation, light on the surface, loaded underneath. Not necessarily because they're finally ready to love properly, but because fear has caught up with them. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being replaced, fear of a life where your presence isn't available on demand anymore. They start reaching out, but often from the same self-protective place that made them run in the first place. They want relief from the emptiness before they're willing to actually take responsibility for causing it. And when they don't get the response they were expecting, when your silence holds steady, when your peace doesn't bend back toward them, another layer of their defenses cracks. They start to understand something that cuts right through the ego. They were never fully in control of how this story would end. You were never some permanent emotional resource. You were a person, with limits, with a breaking point, and with the capacity to heal. That truth hits harder than rejection ever could, because rejection can be blamed on bad timing or a misunderstanding. But your healing leaves them nowhere to hide. It proves the issue was never that love failed. It's that love was right there, and they simply didn't know how to honor it while they had it. For someone who hides behind emotional distance, the collapse is quiet. It doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. They still go to work. They still answer texts. They still laugh on cue. They still post the pictures. They move through their day wearing the same composed expression. But internally, something has shifted. The silence that used to comfort them now closes in on them. The same walls that once made them feel safe start to feel suffocating, tight, impossible to escape. They lie awake longer than usual. They replay old conversations. They finally hear things you said that never really landed before. They remember the exact tone in your voice the last time you tried to reach them. They remember how much room you made for their fear. They remember meeting your honesty with delay, your softness with hesitation, your loyalty like it was something that would never run out. These realizations aren't loud, they're suffocating, and that's exactly what makes them so powerful. This kind of pain doesn't announce itself, it just sits there. It waits in the quiet moments, the empty rooms, the pause right after laughter fades, the seconds before sleep, the space where distraction finally stops working. And when it does show up, they start to feel what they once put you through: the ache of not being met, the loneliness of emotional distance, the sting of wanting closeness after spending so long teaching it to walk away. Your presence was never just attention to them. It was structure. It was quiet reassurance. It was proof that someone still saw value in them, even when they couldn't offer any stability back. You were the emotional safety net they pretended they didn't need, the steady heartbeat in the background, the person who made life feel less hollow without ever demanding they admit how much that actually meant. That's why your absence changes everything. Not because they lost praise, not because they lost convenience, because they lost the quiet force that had been balancing out their internal chaos. They might have called your warmth overwhelming while they had it, but the second it's gone, they feel the cold immediately. At first, it's subtle. They reach for their phone for no real reason. Your name pops into their head during ordinary moments. Places start feeling flatter. Music starts feeling heavier. Even silence itself starts to feel different in texture. What used to feel like freedom now starts to feel like a room without windows. And here's the line they never wanted to face. Peace was never the absence of love. Peace is the presence of safety. And your love, however they misread it at the time, gave them exactly that. It gave them a place where they could be seen without performing, held without pressure, known without pretending. Once they feel that contrast, once they truly see what your energy was doing for them, the emptiness gets a lot harder to explain away. Of course, they'll try to fight it. Distraction becomes their first line of defense. Work, noise, friends, new conversations, new attention, new faces, anything to keep the feeling from settling in. But distraction only works when the pain is shallow. This pain isn't shallow, it's rooted in recognition. They're not just lonely, they're grieving something specific, the loss of a rare kind of care, the loss of someone who knew how to stay gentle without being weak, the loss of someone who saw past the armor and chose to love anyway. That's hard to replace because most people simply don't have the patience or strength to keep loving someone who keeps retreating from the exact thing they claim to want. Over time, the truth becomes harder and harder to outrun. They start to understand that you didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because staying kept hurting you. You didn't turn cold. You became clear. You didn't disappear to punish them. You walked away to protect whatever was left of your own heart. That realization changes the emotional weight of everything, because now it's no longer easy for them to paint themselves as misunderstood or just unlucky. Now they have to face the possibility that the love they wanted was right there in front of them, and fear taught them to damage it before it ever had the chance to ask them to grow. This is where regret turns into something even heavier. They start replaying every moment they ruined, the conversations where honesty could have changed everything, the apologies they almost gave but didn't, the texts they left unanswered because responding felt too exposing, the nights they chose silence over softness, the times they knew you were hurting and stayed wrapped up in their own pride anyway. Every single memory becomes a private lesson that arrives far too late. They start to understand that love rarely dies in one big blow-up. More often, it just fades from neglect. It erodes under repeated emotional absence. It collapses when one person keeps knocking and the other keeps making the door feel heavier and heavier. What they once labeled self-protection starts looking a lot more like self-sabotage. What they once called logic starts sounding like fear dressed up in nicer words. And once they see that pattern clearly, they can't unsee it. That's why the breaking point matters so much. It's not just about missing you. It's about realizing they had a hand in the loss. They helped build that distance. They helped train your heart to stop hoping. They helped turn something alive into something completely unreachable. If you're still with me, listen closely because this part really lands. The heart they thought they were protecting turns out to be the very heart they damaged, not just yours, but their own too. Because every single time they chose avoidance over honesty, they weren't just denying you closeness, they were denying themselves the healing that closeness might have actually given them. For people like this, real love can feel foreign because it asks for things they were never taught how to give comfortably: trust, openness, emotional honesty, consistency. It asks them to stay present when every old wound is screaming at them to retreat. It asks them to be truly seen without controlling how they're perceived, to let someone matter without already planning their exit. That can feel absolutely terrifying when your entire identity has been built around self-protection. So they want connection, just not full exposure. They want affection, just not dependence. They want love, but only if it doesn't touch the places they've locked away. And the moment it does touch those places, they start hunting for flaws. Suddenly you're too emotional, too intense, too available, too invested, too much. But later, when the room goes quiet and the memories start speaking clearly, they finally understand. It was never that your love was too much. It's that their defenses were too loud. Your care asked them to open a door they'd sworn they'd never open again. Your consistency challenged a belief they'd carried for years, that closeness always ends in pain, shame, disappointment, or losing themselves. By the time they figure that out, it's often too late, because the person who was willing to love through their walls has already stepped back. And people like that don't come around often. Hearts like that don't stick around forever where they're not being fully received. The hardest part for them usually isn't losing the relationship itself. It's watching who you become after it ends. They never expected you to actually heal. They assumed your pain would keep you tethered to them. They counted on your empathy, your patience, your habit of understanding them even when they didn't understand themselves. Somewhere in their mind, they believed that whenever they eventually turned back around, you'd still be exactly where they left you. Same hope, same open door. But healing changes the shape of love. It teaches your heart new standards. It teaches silence to mean closure instead of invitation. So when they finally see you calm, grounded, no longer reaching, no longer trying to be chosen by someone too afraid to choose, something inside them shakes. Because now your silence isn't wounded anymore. It's free. Your distance isn't a reaction anymore. It's peace. You're not waiting around. You're actually living. And that's the moment their whole illusion collapses completely. They realize they didn't just lose access to your attention. They lost the version of you that used to make excuses for their fear. They lost the emotional shelter your love provided while asking for so little in return. And nothing stings the ego quite like watching someone you once took for granted become whole without you. That kind of transformation forces a truth on them they can't soften or explain away. While they were busy avoiding pain, you were quietly turning your pain into strength. That reversal is devastating for them because it strips away every fantasy they used to comfort themselves with. They can't tell themselves you're still secretly available. They can't pretend you're frozen in the same spot where they left you. They can't keep believing they can waltz back in whenever they get lonely enough. Your growth exposes exactly what their avoidance cost them. You're no longer trying to pull love out of someone closed off. You're no longer proving your worth through patience. You're no longer confusing endurance with destiny. And watching that happen does something to them. It shows them that what they assumed was permanent was actually temporary. That your love had limits. That your softness was never weakness. That your loyalty never meant unlimited access. In that moment, regret becomes heavier than nostalgia, because it's no longer about some hypothetical loss. It's about what was actually possible. A real relationship, a real home, a real chance to feel safe in love instead of suspicious of it. They start to understand that your care was never asking too much of them. It was offering them something they never believed they deserved in the first place. And because they couldn't bring themselves to believe in it, they mishandled it. They pushed against it. They minimized it. They kept waiting for it to turn dangerous just so they'd have an excuse to keep their guard up. But it was never the danger they needed protecting from. It was their fear, their pride, their delay. And by the time that truth becomes undeniable, your heart is no longer standing there waiting to be let in. So in the end, what really breaks them isn't just the absence, it's the awareness. The awareness that love was right there and they couldn't meet it. The awareness that the person who once would have stayed forever finally chose themselves instead. The awareness that silence, which once felt like protection, has quietly turned into punishment. Their collapse isn't loud, because they're experts at hiding internal damage behind outward composure. But make no mistake, it's real. It shows up in sleepless nights, in old messages reread in private, in memories that hit hardest at the worst possible hours, in the ache of realizing no one's coming to fill the emptiness anymore. It shows up when they finally understand that distance never erased the attachment. It only delayed the moment that attachment would curdle into regret. And that regret sits heavy because it carries truth with it. They weren't abandoned by love. They defended themselves against it until it finally left. They weren't trapped by connection. They were invited into it, and they got scared. They didn't lose you because you stopped caring. They lost you because they never learned how to stop running when something real showed up. And if there's one final truth in all of this, it's this. Your healing was never their punishment. It's your freedom. Their pain isn't proof that you should go back. It's proof that what you gave them was real. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let your silence finally say what your heart tried to say for far too long without ever being heard. And sometimes that silence becomes the exact mirror they can no longer look away from.